Alright guys, just after quarter after 5 Thursday evening, and I've got the trans waiting here for me. I did not come out to the garage last night. Just had a feeling that I was burning the candle at both ends, so we took a night off. Anyway, the first thing I'm going to do out here tonight is to clean up this hardware that I'd mentioned I had soaking in some mineral spirits the other night. So we've got it fairly degreased. So we'll get the wire brush out and clean the rest of that stuff up. Ellen did actually stop by last night and drop my two throwout bearings off, the carrier and the bearing. I did have him press this old one I had on. This is an old RHP bearing made in the UK. You can see it's significantly smaller than the Koyo bearing from Japan. Anyway, we're going to go with the Koyo, and we'll have a little bit more of a discussion about this when we go to put it back in the transmission. For right now, we'll concentrate on cleaning this up, getting new nylocks, new lock washers, etc. And all with a plan to get this mated to the rear of the engine at some point. Not sure if that's going to happen tonight, but I'd like for it to happen soon, so we'll do everything we can to make that happen. Alright guys, sitting in front of the transmission, and we're going to have a little discussion piece before we install the throwout bearing onto the nose piece. There's a few things to take into consideration. All right, kind of like an oil discussion. The first question is whether or not to grease the area where the bearing carrier slides. And I'm in the camp that says no grease, no oil. Just make sure that your nose piece here is polished and smooth. You've got nothing, no big scratches, no finger catchers in there, no grit, etc. Make sure that's nicely polished for your carrier to slide nicely back and forth. So that's number one. No grease, no oil. The thought behind that is that if you add grease or oil to that surface, it's going to end up getting contaminated with dirt and grime, and it's just going to prevent your carrier from sliding forward and backwards in a nice fashion. So that's why no grease, no oil. The second discussion piece on this throwout bearing, and I'm using the Koyo throwout bearing as mentioned, is this little pin here. And if you can see that pin, this is called an anti-spin pin. So most of the suppliers of this bearing now actually do not supply this anti-spin pin. They think it's not required. I think Moss, if you go on the Moss website, it says not required. So this wasn't originally equipped with the anti-spin pin. There is a hole drilled in the carrier for the pin. They just do not supply it. So I've gone ahead and created a pin. This is actually a steel rivet that I actually used and just shortened and put it in there. And that anti-spin pin fits between the forks. So it's supposed to be, if you read the Bentley manual, 12 o'clock between the two pins on the fork. That's where that's supposed to be located. So I am a proponent of the anti-spin pin, and I add it to my throwout bearing carrier. Your mileage. Another discussion piece while we're up here is the actual cross shaft. And one of my viewers and a fellow TR6 and 250 owner, Kevin, asked me whether I was going to add in a grease zerk to grease the actual cross shaft. And I'm not going to do that. I'm actually just going to grease here through the bearings where the cross shaft goes through. I've not done this modification on my TR6. I believe the earlier cars like my TR3 actually have the greasable cross shafts in them already, so it's just the later cars that some people feel the need to add the actual greasable points on this cross shaft, but I'm not going to be doing it on this. I'm just going to apply some grease at the bearing, slide the shaft in, and we'll be good to go. So if anybody wants to do any further reading on either whether it's a gearbox or clutch, throwout bearing, whatever, there's a very good, there goes my light, but it's telling me the battery is running out. Anyway, there's a very good technical section on the Buckeye Triumph's website. So look up Buckeye Triumph's technical, just Google that, and you'll be able to find some excellent technical articles, not only on the A-type overdrive gearbox, but also the J-type, and everything associated with the clutch and transmission. It's a very good read. So I highly recommend the Buckeye Triumph's website for that type of information if you're looking for it. Alright guys, another topic of discussion while we're here, dowel pins, and I'd mentioned this on a previous video as well. These are extremely important and often left out on TR250, TR6 restorations. These pins are used for the correct mating of the transmission to the engine block. There are two locations for these dowel pins. They are machined exactly to fit in these openings, and I believe this one goes here. They do not fit actually in the other openings where your bolt locations are, so you'll be able to find where these two dowel pin locations are. So it's very important to use these dowel pins. They just slide back. That's as far as they push in. So make sure you have these dowels installed in order to line your transmission up. If you do not use these dowels, it can adversely affect your clutch operation. And I can speak from experience. When I did my TR6 restoration, I don't know how many years ago that was now, I did not use the dowel pins, and I had a sort of a juddery or a sticking clutch, and that was probably due to the release bearing not being aligned properly with the engine block. So I removed the trans, added the dowel pins, and it was like night and day. That fixed the problem. So I'll never do another transmission without actually utilizing the dowel pins. So highly recommend that you fit your dowel pins, get new dowel pins when you're mating this to the rear of the engine block. Alright, last topic of discussion before we actually go ahead and install this throwout bearing. And the last topic is, do I grease the splines? And the answer to that question is yes. Generally I do grease a little bit on the splines, and I use the grease that's supplied, and this is actually supplied with the friction disc. So I do actually grease the splines a little bit. You don't want to put too much on. You don't want to be slinging it around the clutch area. So I do just put a really thin coating of grease on the splines. Alright guys, throwout bearing has been installed. Again with the anti-spin pin straight up at 12 o'clock. We have our dowel pins installed in the correct locations. We have our cross shaft greased in the bushings. And we've got our safety wire on our pin. Got our safety bolt through. So I guess we're ready to mate this up to the engine block. We've got our hardware over here all shined up and ready to go. So apparently, according to the manual, there are 3 studs and there are 8 bolts, lock washers, and nuts. So I guess there's no excuse but to fit this to the engine. Alright guys, it's Friday and we're just back on the mating the engine to the transmission or vice versa project. And I've just created a couple of longer pins, just some bolts with the heads cut off and a little slot cut in for a screwdriver, so I can screw 2 of these into the outside stud locations at the top. I'll show these to you once I get them installed. Anyway, the objective of these is to guide the transmission in a little easier than just hanging on the short studs. Plus you tend to damage the short studs because the threads are right at the front of the short studs, and if you hang the tranny or try and slide the tranny over the short studs, you'll destroy the threads. So these 2 outside bolts are to prevent that and to help with alignment and to help with holding the trans in place a little bit better so you don't hang it on the nose of the input shaft. Alright, see you in a bit. Alright guys, here's the setup. So we've got the engine hooked up to the engine hoist. We've got a foam pad at the back here and a milk crate, so the engine cannot push back any further, and it's going to be blocking the little dolly that the engine is on, because obviously we're going to be applying pressure to the front of the engine, and we don't want the engine to be pushing back every time we try to put the transmission on. So that's the setup to keep it from rolling backwards. We do have the front of the engine up a little bit off the off the dolly at the front, because we want the front flange of the diff to be able to match up. So it's just sort of hanging a little bit. We're probably going to crank it up maybe one more crank, but we didn't want the dolly to interfere with the bottom of the transmission to slide on, so we've done that. We've got our 2 dowel pins in here, which are going to help us a little bit, hopefully. Slide that in, and so that's it. We're pretty much ready to go, I think. And looks like my hydraulics are, I don't know if my lift is dropping a little bit. Anyway, we'll go crank it up and crank down the make sure that pin is closed so the hydraulics don't drop any further. Alright, we'll be back. I'm just using my motorcycle jack on the rear, and you can see we've got the pins lined up on the front here. So we're just going to attempt to slide it in and see if they'll come together. Hard to get this on video, guys, so sorry, but it's hard work and I can't video at the same time. Oh, I don't really want to video at the same time. I suppose I could put you on a tripod, but I don't want you to see me struggle either. It's not an easy job. Alright guys, it's successfully on the back of the engine, and sorry I didn't get it on video, but it's hard enough to do it off video as opposed to you watching me struggle on video. So it's always a bit of a chore to get everything aligned, but once you do, it slides in fairly easily. So I've just got it held on there with about 4 bolts so far. We'll go around and we'll finish that up shortly. Just wanted to show you that I got it on there. Those dowel pins work really well. They are slotted, as I had mentioned, so you can now back them out with a screwdriver and put the other studs back in. So we'll go ahead and we'll do that shortly. So the next step of this project is to obviously do the rest of the fasteners up, and then we'll get it into the chassis. So stay tuned.